Welcome everyone, I am Jeff Rich. This is the Birding Archive YouTube channel, and this is my live stream on 6th of June at about 9 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, where I am talking about narratives of the world crisis. Are we in Armageddon, or are we in a Polycrisis? And I'll be contrasting two differing views about that sort of world crisis, and just wanting to check that I'm still actually on. I assume I'm on, so I'm going to keep going. I seem to be appearing, but I just can't. Just give me a second, everyone. Sorry about that. Yes, I'm all good. So I'm still getting used to the technology and getting everything going on the whole live stream. So we're all good, and I will continue on with the stream. So on this stream, I'm talking about narratives of the world crisis, and there's a lot of things happening in the world today. There's war, there have been pandemics, there have been political crises, there have been so many different things. And it can just be a little bit overwhelming, and our minds tend to want to find a way to make sense of it all. Is it a grand conspiracy? Is it a great reset conspiracy? Is it all about the bad American empire? Is it all about the bad Russian empire? Is it Armageddon, or is it some complex thing called a polycrisis? That's what we're sort of talking about here tonight. And I'll also update you all with a little bit of news on sort of my work, and talk about some of the stuff that I've had going on. So I hope that's going to be a good show for you. So I'm going to be talking about the Polycrisis as I sort of described it on my podcast that came out last Friday night. I will talk about, in a little bit more depth, about Adam Tooze, the economic historian's idea about a polycrisis. And I will then contrast that with a seemingly very different, but maybe not so different in some respects, Russian thinker Alexander Dugin, notorious in some quarters Russian thinker. Hopefully I won't get a black mark on YouTube merely for mentioning his name, but there we go. And he's actually just published something in the last week or so that caught my eye. In fact, I think I read it on Saturday or Sunday after the podcast on the world crisis came out. And it was an article entitled, I think, "The Special Military Operation in the Context of World History." It was trying to tell the overall narrative of what's going on in the Russia-Ukraine war in a very big context. In fact, he even talks about it in terms of the end times. And so my thumbnail has been talking about Polycrisis, apparently a technical economic term, versus Armageddon. But in fact, are there some kinship between those two ideas? I should say, so I'm going to talk about that, those things, and I'll just also briefly mention my article that's just been published, Australia, Little Country Lost. It's been published at John Menadue, menadue.com. It's one of the leading articles there, and it's all about the Indo-Pacific, that currently fashionable term in international relations strategy. The United States of America has, in the last year or so, I think, released an Indo-Pacific strategy, and NATO wants to be an Indo-Pacific alliance as well as a North Atlantic alliance. And Australia has been talking up big over the last decade or so, the whole idea of the Indo-Pacific. And my article takes a bit of a critical look at that concept and suggests an alternative way in which Australia can see its foreign policy. I've done a couple of articles now that have attacked sort of Western ideas about the Ukraine war and criticised the American empire. But in this article, I was also keen to sort of offer a bit of a constructive alternative as well, and to suggest, if you like, what might happen if Australia stood with India in the Quad rather than kneeling before the United States of America. And you can read that article. And in fact, I'm also going to be talking about it in a little bit more depth on my podcast on Friday, which I'll also do on the YouTubes. And what my current plan is, I'm still experimenting with these live streams, but I think what I'm going to do is live stream on the topic of my podcast on the Tuesday after I produce the podcast. So the podcast comes out on Friday. Everyone's got a chance to listen to it over the weekend, absorb all the nonsense and the occasional insights that might be in there. And then, if you like, you can join me for a live chat discussion on a Tuesday. But otherwise, I will also just extemporize a little bit on some of the themes of the podcast and also add a little bit to it. And I guess that builds on what I'm also doing with my Substack, where I provide a little bit more text-heavy kind of enrichment of some of the themes that I talk about on the podcast. So you can always subscribe to my free weekly newsletter, Glimpses of the Multipolar World, at Jeff Rich, that's Jeff with a J and Rich, R-I-C-H, .substack.com, free weekly newsletter. And there are also options there to upgrade your subscription and to support me. And if you do that, you'll get some extra bonus material. You'll get a fortnightly sort of essay from me on some important issue. In fact, I've just started on the Substack a whole series exploring this whole concept of the world crisis and the polycrisis. What does world crisis mean? What does polycrisis mean? And how, in thinking about it now, do I think differently to say what I did 2 years ago, where I said there were 4 big themes of the current world crisis of social fragmentation, political disorder, cultural decay, and imperial rivalry. And I think, clashes between the great powers of the world. Sometimes people object to the term empire, but you could also call them great states, rivalry between the great states of the world, the really powerful states of the world. And I still think those 4 themes are pretty dominant in things, but I think there's also some other things that I'll be exploring in that series of articles on Substack. So you can do that, and I'll talk more about the article on Australia, Little Country Lost, next week. But I will just quickly show you. There you can see it there, Australia, Little Country Lost. And with the painting, it's a famous, iconic Australian painting of I think it's a boy lost in the bush, a little boy lost. Something which happened quite a lot in 19th century Australia, as you could imagine. And you can sort of check that article there at johnmenadue.com. Okay, so those are things. Let me also acknowledge two things. One, today, the 6th of June, is Russian Language Day. It also celebrates the birthday of the great Russian writer Alexander Pushkin, who I was just learning in my Russian class earlier tonight, is often called Nashi Visyo. All of ours, and he's a very crucial figure in the Russian language, in Russian culture, in Russian history as well. And I was just getting out my Pushkin earlier today just to celebrate that, the book of novels and tales, including the great story The Captain's Daughter, I think, which is perhaps not entirely irrelevant to conflicts in Ukraine at the moment. And then, of course, the great novel in verse, Eugene Onegin. I remember watching the opera of Eugene Onegin, which I think the score was by Tchaikovsky or Mussorgsky, I'm not quite sure. And of course his great poems like The Bronze Horseman as well. So let's just take a moment to celebrate the Russian language and the legacy from the burning archive of the great Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin on this day. And of course, also I have to acknowledge the news has been coming through this afternoon that the Nova Kakhovia Dam on the Dnieper River near Kherson has been bombed and flooded this afternoon and this evening, which is potentially risking the lives of thousands of people. It's a terrible disaster. And, there have been a number of confident assertions that Russia did this, and there's been a number of more careful and more considered assertions that it probably was Ukraine that did this. So I guess at this point the main thing is everything is done responsibly and well to protect the lives of the people who are potentially in the path of the floodwaters, and most critically of all, that the water supply is kept up for the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, currently occupied by Russian forces, which kind of makes you think maybe Ukraine might have done it. And of course that the people of Crimea continue to have a reliable water supply. I mean, it was only at the start of the special military operation that Russia was able to bomb the obstructions Ukraine had put in the place of the Crimean water supply, and that the risk to fresh water being supplied to Crimea seems to have been returned. So I can only speculate that that was probably an action of Ukraine. But there you go, Polycrisis. We could potentially have a major nuclear catastrophe in Ukraine, and a humanitarian disaster with many people's lives at risk. So that's all preliminaries. If you are live, I'm still new to these live streams and live chats, do send us a note on the old chat, and I'm really happy to answer any questions along the way. It's great to know if you're online and where you're from and that sort of thing, and just pop in a chat there and I'll do my best to respond live. But if you're watching it on the replay, which I do, it's both on the live tab of the YouTube channel, and usually now these days I sort of cut a section of the lives and post that as a separate video as well. do leave us a comment as well, and I'll try to pick up on those comments next week. So look, the main points I really wanted to talk about today were this idea of world crisis, this idea of polycrisis, and not so much debate the merits or otherwise. I think in some previous videos I've compared the current situation to World War One, and I've also on my podcast on Friday looked at how the current situation is similar or different to World War One. But what I really wanted to focus in on today is just how we tell stories about the world crisis and how that can help us or harm us or drive us mad. And I think an issue that a lot of people are really facing at the moment is all these events going on at the moment make it challenging to stay sane, to stay calm and considered, and focus on a positive and constructive life going forward. And just excuse me 1 second, I just have to deal with something at the moment. So yes, I will. So yeah, I think there's this whole issue of. I mean, there are huge dramatic events happening, and inevitably you kind of want to make sense of them, don't you? Like, is this going to be World War III? What should I do? Am I at risk myself personally? Am I at risk financially? Am I at risk in some other kind of way? Is my country at risk? Is my culture at risk? Is my language at risk? And what do I do about it? But like someone like me in remote southeastern Australia, far away from any conflict in Europe, not so far away from a potential conflict in the South China Sea, but still a fair way away from a potential conflict in the South China Sea. It does seem a long way off. How do I carry on with my life and not get sort of sucked into a whole lot of false drama about world events, or standing with one side or another, or catastrophizing, I guess, about what's going on in the world? And the way in which we tell the stories and narratives of world crisis really matter a lot about that. And so I kind of wanted to look at two different ways that are prominent, I guess, at the moment for telling that, and look at, I guess, both how they can be helpful and how they can be maybe not so helpful, as a bit of a launch pad for any questions that you might have, and as a general discussion about how you can, I guess, approach history in a mindful way, not just in a catastrophizing way, if you like, or a conspiratorial way, is another thing. So that's what I'm going to sort of talk about, these two contrasting stories. If you haven't listened to my podcast from last Friday, do check it out. It's quite interesting. It's really got 3 parts. It looks at, I sort of begin by saying, well, I mean, I've been using this line that was stated by Xi Jinping when he met with Vladimir Putin in Moscow. I think it was in March this year, that the world is going through changes it has not seen for 100 years. The world's in a kind of crisis it hasn't seen for 100 years. And if you think about that, 100 years takes us back to World War One. Yeah. And well, you know, a lot of things have happened since World War One. That's a lot of big changes. So that's a pretty high stakes thing. And just give me a second. I'm doing this this live stream at a later time than normal, so it's all just sort of, you know, working around people's different routines. So I hope you don't mind a bit of live action here. Those of you who are watching live, that's just real life intruding, or adds to the drama. Okay, so yeah, 3 parts to the podcast were what's true, what's false about whether the world is changing more now than it has for 100 years, and then how does the current world crisis, if we accept it is a world crisis, which, you know, for argument's sake, let's just accept it is a world crisis. I mean, there's a very big war, and there's a lot of talk about changing, you know, power balance in the world, and you know, the rise of the you know, fall of America, the rise of China, that sort of thing. So how does this world crisis compare with the world crisis between 1910 and 1920 around the World War One? And then finally, I sort of look back to a text from the Burning Archive, a fragment of the Burning Archive, one of the famous sayings from the literary modernist Virginia Woolf, that on or about December 1910, human character changed, and there is a sense that at the moment there is this sort of a bit of a sense, in at least in some circles, that some of the fundamental things about human character are being a bit thrown up in the air. There is a little bit of the same feeling that the world as we know it doesn't quite seem to be the same, and that coming to terms with that is quite a challenge. How do you come to terms with that? Do you revert back to tradition? Do you embrace this brave new world? Are you fearful of it? Do you ignore the big changes and focus in on your more immediate and domestic controllable environment? I think one of the interesting things in some of the discussions I've heard about this whole issue over recent times, including, for example, on Alex Kashuta's podcast, Subversive, is how we all individually wrestle with, you know, how do we live now in this world crisis? I think in many ways that's amongst the most interesting aspects of it. It's much more than just a crisis of war and politics and geopolitics and finance. I think it's also got lots of social and cultural and, I guess, psychological dimensions as well. And I'm going to be actually exploring some of those in my Substack articles over the next couple of months. The Substack article, I mean, there'll be aspects of that will be in the free weekly newsletter, but there'll also be discussion of this in the sort of upgraded paid version, or paid subscription, so you can support me and my work, and just, I think it's $8 a week, $8 Australian maybe a week, I can't do currency conversions for you, I'm afraid, but I think that's what it is. And I'd really appreciate it if you wanted to take out a paid subscription to support me doing all this kind of work. And for that, you'll get like a fortnightly essay over the next couple of months that will explore all 7 dimensions of this world crisis under the idea of a polycrisis. And that's what I'll turn to next, the polycrisis. Now, polycrisis is a term that has been popularised, as I described on the podcast, by Adam Tooze, and he is a economic historian, British born, I think, but he grew up in the Federal Republic of Germany, and he lives, I think, a very international life. I think he's based as so many people are in one of the American universities these days. But he sort of has produced a series of quite brilliant economic histories of, I guess, the financial power sinews and the interaction between finance and great power politics. One based around the sort of 1935 sort of time period called The Deluge. Then he wrote a great book called Crashed, Crashed, which covered the series of financial crises from 2008 into the Eurozone crisis. In fact, even into the period around 2014-15 and the start of the NATO-Russia-Ukraine war back in 2014. And he's also written a book called The Shutdown, which describes what happened economically during the whole COVID crisis. And he's really quite, I think, a brilliant scholar, and he can work at different levels. He can work at a sort of popular explanation level, at a kind of senior decision-making level, but also at a highly subtle, I guess, scholarly level. If you've read Adam Tooze's work, sing out and let us know on chat. And if you've got any questions along the way, really happy to answer any questions. One of the benefits of having not many live viewers is if you do answer a question, I'll be able to give it lots of attention, because there's not, like a wild stream of endless chat that I can't quite follow. So do ask us a question if you're viewing on the live chat, and if you're watching on the replay, send us a comment and I'll respond in the next day or so. So Adam Tooze has popularised this concept of the polycrisis. And he says, if you've been feeling confused and as though everything is impacting on you all at the same time, this is not a personal, private experience. This is actually a collective experience. And the polycrisis is, I think a useful idea. I don't think it's a brilliant idea. I mean, basically, all it's saying is that more than one thing is happening at once, and that's just I spent 30 years in government. I mean, like, that's every day. There's more than one crisis going on at once, all the time. But the scale, I guess, what he's saying is the type and the scale of the crises that are going on is much bigger. And he sort of has this idea that there are big changes happening, and those big changes are not just happening, but they're actually creating a bit of havoc. They're creating a bit of harm for people. and in a very unstable, unpredictable way. That that means that the sort of decision makers have kind of both lost control of events, as well as had been exposed, I guess, as having some sort of mismatch between their model of reality, how they, the kind of framework with which they view the world, like America is number one, and American financial power will be able to ensure that whatever America wants, it will get in the world. But the Polycrisis is such that, well, American dollar's influence seems to be waning, and its assumptions about applying economic sanctions to Russia proved wrong, and it was not able to just do what it wants, and then all these other countries are arcing up, setting up trade deals and all the rest of it, which seem to change how things are happening. And not only that, but all these crises together present questions about the identity or the future of the society. Is this an existential conflict for Russia? Is it an existential conflict for NATO, for Europe, or indeed, as the French scholar Emmanuel Todd has argued, for America itself? But it's particularly, I think, the most interesting aspect of the way in which Adam Tooze presents the idea of the Polycrisis is that it is this exposed gap between reality and the mental model that decision makers use to try to control or manipulate reality, and that's not just being exposed in a nice leisurely academic seminar where you can kind of work out what the differences and how you can cope with the differences and how people have argued about that over time, but it's happening amongst the chaos of events, dear boy, events, and you are responding to all of that under extreme stress. But it's also creates stress not just for decision makers, like big powerful decision makers, but it creates stress for all of us. We as just ordinary people living in the culture, or ordinary citizens of whatever country we live in, we are trying to make sense of these events and come up with an appropriate mental model. So I think that's the most interesting aspect of Adam Tooze's idea of the Polycrisis, and I go into that a little bit more in the podcast on Friday, so you can listen to that on Spotify or Apple or whatever you get your podcasts from. But I also load the podcasts on the YouTube channel, just with like an audio file with a sort of static image kind of thing. But his basic idea is that by naming all this stuff going wrong as the Polycrisis, it can help us. It's sort of like what you might almost do in a psychologically therapeutic situation. You sort of name the problem and detach from it, ground yourself, calm yourself, and try to start to see what the problem is or what the situation is, just tease it out. He says basically a kind of message of relief, in a sense. If you've been having a hard time reducing all of this to a common denominator, then join the club. If your ability to insulate your house because you want to pursue an agenda of climate neutrality is being followed by the fact that all of the materials cost too much because supply chains are screwed up. That is the reality we currently face. What the Polycrisis concept says is relax. This is actually the condition of our current moment. I think that's useful, giving the sense a name. It's therapeutic. Here is your fear. Here is something that fundamentally distresses you. This is what it might be called. And look, I think that's true. I think to some degree it's also just dressing up the general sense of, life being out of control. I mean, is it the condition of our current moment, or is it the human condition as such that everything is always happening everywhere at once in human history? But I do think it's a useful concept. I tend to find that Adam Tooze focuses a little bit too much for my tastes on the sort of, big geoeconomics and geopolitical questions. He doesn't really get to the kind of things that Virginia Woolf was referring to back in 1910 of human character changing, of human relationships changing, and that flowing through to art and religion and culture, social relations and politics. And I do feel that part of what is getting at people in this current world crisis is more that social cultural thing. In the end, after a little bit of panic about toilet paper or whatever, or books taking a couple of weeks to arrive rather than a couple of days to arrive on the home delivery front, we all do actually get used to that and accommodate that. But some of these bigger questions of culture and society and identity are much harder to get used to. Do let us know if you've got any chats or questions. So that's Adam Tooze. I think he's quite an interesting thinker, quite a pragmatic thinker, quite a grounded thinker. But he doesn't focus so much on society and culture. Now, our sort of second person in the pair is Alexander Dugin. And Alexander Dugin is not an economist at all. He's a philosopher, a Russian philosopher, but also a Russian philosopher who articulates a kind of geopolitical strategic worldview. He has been caricatured a little bit in the West as kind of Putin's sort of authoritarian spiritual mastermind or something like that. He's a much more, I understand, I've not read his works in any detail, but I understand he's a much more subtle thinker than that, and heavily informed by Heidegger and others. And that, I guess, philosophical focus comes through in the way he tells the narrative of the current world crisis, which is a very big picture philosophical kind of worldview. Indeed, his article about seeing the special military operation in the context of world history very much articulates this. He in fact says, let me just open this up for you in a second. He says, Western civilization even in modern times, has never been so close to a direct and overt embodiment of the Antichrist's reign. Religion and its truths have long since been abandoned by the West in favour of an aggressive secularism and an atheistic, materialistic worldview assumed as absolute truth. The SMO is the beginning, the SMO, the Special Military Operation, is the beginning of the eschatological battle between sacred tradition and the modern world, which precisely in the form of liberal ideology and globalist politics has reached its most sinister, toxic and radical expression. This is why we increasingly speak of Armageddon, the last decisive battle between the armies of God and Satan. So this is not some calming, therapeutic kind of way of putting things. This is very much trying to dig into the deep spiritual heart of what's going on and portraying it literally as a fight between good and evil, between the sacred world and the sort of evil secularist religion. And now you might just say, well, it's just a Russian propagandist. But I mean, if you think about the way in which many Western commentators have talked about the conflict in Ukraine as a World War II like battle between democracy and autocracy, a battle in which the future of Western civilization is at stake. There is some of the same rhetorical tone in some of those comments. And I'm not meaning to endorse what Dugin has said. All I'm sort of saying, it's an interesting view. And what's also interesting about it is the way in which he frames it in terms of a historical narrative, or the kind of concepts he uses to do that. He argues that, in fact, you can't really understand what's going on in this current war by looking at the technical details and the economy and the logistics and all that sort of stuff. It can only be understood, he says, in the context of large-scale approaches. And he mentions, let me count them, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the first of those is geopolitics. And when you hear this, you'll see a lot of what Dugin says is said from, I guess, a Russian point of view, celebrating where Russia's at. But it's actually using very similar concepts to what many people in the West who argue the alternative view also articulate. So he says the fundamental large-scale approach is geopolitics, and this is based on the consideration of the deadly duel between the civilizations of the sea and the civilizations of the land, which identifies the final aggravation of the Great Continental War. Now, effectively, he's just re-articulating the ideas of Halford Mackinder and I think it's Carl Hofson. And I'm actually going to be talking about some of them more in my podcast on Friday, where I talk about the Indo-Pacific, because the Indo-Pacific is a creature of this kind of geopolitical thinking. It's a creature of this idea that there is a conflict between the pirates of the sea and the pirates of the land, of the steppe. It's the contest to control the world island. That still informs the work of someone like Zbigniew Brzezinski and most American geostrategists and British geostrategists. The second point that Dugin really focuses on is civilizational analysis, the clash of civilizations, modern Western civilization claiming hegemony against emerging non-Western alternative civilizations. The third point is the definition of the future architecture of the world order, the contradiction between a unipolar and a multipolar world. The fourth is the culmination of world history, the final phase of the emergence of a Western model of global dominance facing a fundamental crisis. He's really, if you like, attacking the Francis Fukuyama idea of the end of history here. A macro analysis of political economy built on the fixation of the collapse of global capitalism. I suspect Adam Tooze will offer you a better analysis of the political economy of the current world crisis than Alexander Dugin. And then finally, religious eschatology, describing the last times and their inherent conflicts, clashes and disasters, as well as the phenomenology of the coming of the Antichrist. This is how geopolitics sees the history of the last centuries. The Russian Empire, the USSR and modern Russia inherited the baton of land-based civilization. In the context of geopolitics, Russia is the eternal Rome, the third Rome, and the modern West is the classical Carthage. And of course, Rome ultimately made a decision to destroy Carthage. So that's Alexander sort of Dugin's view. That's the Armageddon view. So we have a Polycrisis view and we have an Armageddon view. And I guess the point I'd make about the Armageddon view is it's loaded up with a lot of inherited concepts that I don't want to say sort of sex it up, but it sort of gives it a hyper dramatism that on the surface sounds really plausible, but when you start to dig into some of the concepts of civilizations and the sort of land-based empires versus sea-based empires and all that sort of stuff, the real reality, the complex reality of the multipolar world's history is not that simple. And I guess I really have a bit of an issue with anything that tries to describe anything in Armageddon type terms. I think that is pretty dangerous talk. So I'd say neither of these two kind of viewpoints entirely satisfies me. I find the Polycrisis a bit too biased towards an expert economist's sort of view of the world, a bit of a perspective that, all we really need to do is, make sure the guys on Wall Street understand what's happening in the world again and we'll all be fine. And doesn't really acknowledge the kind of cultural crisis I think that many people are experiencing right now. The kind of sense that, well, how do I go about living a decent life, given a lot of the things that are meaningful to me are not easy to live with anymore. And Alexander Dugin does focus, and in quite powerful ways, especially like if you understand the enormous crisis that I guess Russia went through in the 1990s and subsequent couple of decades, he really does have a deep sense of how Western culture, Western civilization hasn't all been good for Russia. And there is some sense in which Russia is making a positive step, getting outside of Western civilization and relying on some of its own strengths. But I reel from the kind of apocalyptic talk of Armageddon. And I'm going to explore some of my own views on how to frame this sort of world crisis in my Substack over the next couple of months. So if you want to read those pieces, all you need to do is to go to jeffrich.substack.com, and you can subscribe for free. You just go there and there's a little email box. You type in your email, click send. You could have probably done it while I've talked you through it right there, and you'll get a free weekly newsletter from me every Saturday morning. And if you take out a paid subscription, which I think is $8 a month, then you will get a fortnightly article from me over the next about 3 months. And then into the future, other new articles, but over the next 3 months, it will all be on this theme of the world crisis. And I'm going to explore 7 dimensions of that world crisis, with the first article coming out next Monday. And that will be about imperial rivalry between great states, what's going on in the international system, the international rules-based order, or the multipolar world order, or the rise and fall of the American empire, or the rise of China and the BRICS, Russia, India, all that sort of stuff. What's going on in terms of great power competition in the world today? Is it more or less dangerous than the Pax Americana? That's what I'll be exploring in the article, and that will come out on Monday. All you need to do is just take a paid subscription, $8 a month, at jeffrich.substack.com, and you'll get a little bit of scholarly insight, I hope, from me, imaginative insight from me, a realistic historical, but a different kind of historical take on current events. Okay, so let me know, those who are viewing, if you've got any chats. I might kind of wrap up the stream sort of there. I think I've covered the main things. Let me also mention that my next podcast is coming out on Friday. That will be about the Indo-Pacific, and it will partly be based on the article that I've just published in Pearls and Irritations, wherever we are. Here we are, Australia, Little Country Lost, and which starts there. You could hear when Biden squibbed the Quad, the Austro-Americans deflate. And it's all about the Indo-Pacific and whether that's really such a great way of describing the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean and all the peoples that live there, or whether it's just the latest incarnation of some of the Western versions of Alexander Dugin's simplistic geopolitics. So that's what my podcast will be about on Friday. I hope you can join me then. If no one wants to ask any questions right now, that's all cool. Thanks so much for joining me on the live stream. Thanks for watching on the replay. Do leave us some comments below, and I'll see you on my next live stream next week, where I'll be talking about the Indo-Pacific. So do join me.